In March 2024, European Robotics Championship in Italy, when high school teams from around Europe competed for a spot at the World Championships in Houston. 4 Lithuanian teams initially protested Russian participation, but eventually competed. Lithuania X and Litbot had to ally with Russian teams to qualify, which presented a dilemma. They raised Lithuanian and Ukrainian flags against the Russian invasion out of loyalty. Their protest resulted in point deductions, disqualifying them, but symbolizing a Baltic trend of De-Russification in response to the Ukraine war. In this video, we'll examine history to understand this major change. Back to history. France's early resistance to Nazi occupation ended on June 15, 1940. After France fell, Hitler and his dictatorship attacked Britain. That tragedy sparked the darkest days in Europe for many countries participating in World War II. But Joseph Stalin and his Soviet cronies saw a chance to consolidate power and strengthen the Soviet Union's defenses against the Nazis. Stalin issued an ultimatum to Lithuania, one of the 3 Baltic Sea states and a potential gateway to Finland. Stalin favored Finland. His ultimatum to Lithuania was straightforward because he had already attacked the country to claim it as Soviet territory. This government must be acceptable to the Soviet Union and let as many troops as Stalin wants to move across the country to Finland. Lithuania's president Antanas Smetona fled, establishing a people's government that allowed the Soviets in. Stalin gave Latvia and Estonia similar ultimatums during the next few days, with similar results. Fast turnaround in Baltic states. The Baltics' most powerful political forces were the communist parties in each country, which were previously weak and had little influence. The Soviets incorporated Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia into the Soviet Union by working with these parties to construct a new system, ignoring their constitutions. The property was nationalized. Mass deportations of women and children to the Soviet Union's harshest desert and polar regions began. Latvia and Lithuania lost 35,000 persons to deportations, while Estonia suffered the most. This country lost 60,000 people. Deportations resumed as the Nazis approached the Baltic states. Initially, many Baltics saw the Nazis as liberators. They anticipated Germany would expel the Soviet Union, freeing each state to re-establish sovereign governments and reclaim nationalized property. Nothing like that happened. Instead, Germany renamed the Baltic territory Ostland and launched Nazification. Germany and the Soviet Union fought over the Baltics for the rest of the war, ending Baltic support for Germany. They were pawns in a global war, and its aftermath showed its effects. The battle cost Lithuania 15%, Estonia 25%, and Latvia 30%, the worst hit. The Baltic republics suffered little respite after World War II's 52,000 wartime and occupation deaths. Stalin worked to integrate the 3 countries into the Soviet Union by making them Soviet republics. Resistance movements failed to stop Soviet industrialization. The Baltics were Soviet nations for 40 years until Mikhail Gorbachev's ascendancy in the mid-1980s. The 1980s changed things. Gorbachev tried to overhaul the Soviet system that decade, giving the Baltics opportunities. Moscow's Lithuanian movement for reconstruction and Latvia and Estonia's popular fronts fought for reform. In 1989, they challenged the legality of the Baltic states' incorporation into the Soviet Union, prompting 500,000 people to form a human chain linking Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia to protest the 1939 German-Soviet non-aggression pact that allowed the Soviets to occupy. Last, 1990 brought real transformation. For the first time in decades, all 3 countries held genuine elections and voted for independence. Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia regained freedom in the 1990s after the Soviet Union dissolved. They established new constitutions, currencies, and international connections. The 2000s saw continued economic progress, peaking in 2004 when all 3 Baltic nations joined NATO and the EU. After 60 years, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia were free of Russian rule. Why is this important? This history helps explain what's happening in the Baltics and why De-Russification is needed. Despite their independence from the USSR, all 3 countries have significant Russian influence. In the last 2 years, all 3 have rejected those influences. De-Russification, Lithuania. Start with Lithuania, whose robotics teams declined to work with Russian teams to win a meaningful competition. Their disobedience represents a Lithuanian movement to minimize Russian influence. After the Ukraine war, Lithuania has been trying to reduce its political influence. In April 2023, Le Monde reported that Lithuania's parliament passed a series of changes that tightened sanctions on Russian citizens seeking citizenship. These penalties stopped Russian applications for temporary residence permits for a year and caused Lithuania to refuse all Russian applications, save in rare cases. Even worse, Lithuania's new regulations barred Russian immigrants from buying property for a year. Thus, even people who enter Lithuania may struggle to obtain housing. This isn't Lithuania attempting to stay neutral in a pointless conflict. Instead, this vote showed that the nation fully supports Ukraine. The immigration numbers show that Lithuania has admitted 75,000 Ukrainian migrants since February 2022, with 42,000 receiving temporary residency cards that will presumably endure as long as the war continues. Yes, more. Lithuania has been weeding out national security threats and restricting Russian citizens' access. According to AP News, Lithuania labeled 1164 Russian and Belarusian residents as risks to its security and revoked their permanent residences in August 2023. These numbers include Belarusians, which is intriguing. They are more affected by the announcement than Russians. 9/10 of 1164 are Belarusian, proving Lithuania isn't merely fighting Russian influence. It also wants Russia's allies gone. Lithuania is nearing the conclusion of its first year of sanctions when this video was written. After rejecting the limitation of unrestricted movement for Russians and Belarusians in Lithuania, the parliament is debating whether to extend citizenship and property ownership bans for another year. This country has made a clear line in the sand. Ukraine has Lithuanian support. That's evident from the fact that all 128 parliamentarians declared Russia's activities in Ukraine a genocide, naming Russia a terrorist state. Lithuania's financial and military aid to Kyiv and readiness to accept Ukrainian migrants demonstrate this. Lithuania said in January 2024 that it would provide Ukraine with $214 million, or 10% of its military budget for 2024. Latvia against Russian influence. Like Lithuania, Lithuania actively punishes Russians who want to relocate to Ukraine because it supports it. Latvia also opposes Russian influence. Latvia, like Lithuania, restricts Russian entry with annual visas. In February 2024, the Foreign Ministry said that Russians won't be permitted in until March 2025 unless they meet severe standards. Russian immigrants must have an EU or Latvian residency permit or be diplomatic workers or their relatives. Latvia has sanctioned Russian citizens, but not as much as Lithuania. In April 2023, the country sanctioned 10 Russians linked to the Kremlin's sentencing of human rights campaigner Vladimir Kara-Murza. They received full travel ban, and Latvia's President Edgars Rinkevičs urged the EU to do the same. Again, national resistance to Russian influence is evident. There's more. Latvia was the first EU country to ban Russian and Belarusian agricultural goods in February 2024. That may be a response to Russia leveraging the Baltic states' port infrastructure and grain storage as a farming hub. Latvia won't import 300 million euros of Russian goods until the embargo is repealed because it doesn't want to help Russian farmers benefit. Latvia appears to be erasing Russian culture. Latvian schools will stop teaching Russian as a second language in 2026-27 and choose one of the other EU official languages. Latvia's de-Russification is long-term. By eliminating Russian from schools, a generation of Latvians won't speak the language and won't work with Russians. A huge population. About 25% of Latvia's 1.8 million people are ethnic Russians, and banning Russians from schools sends a message that their culture is being phased out. Latvia has supported Ukraine throughout the war. Like Lithuania, Latvia joined its Baltic neighbors in calling President Vladimir Putin's invasion a genocide, treating Russia as a terrorist state. Latvia, like Lithuania, provides military and financial aid to Ukraine. Latvian President Edgars Rinkevičs announced a fresh military aid package in January 2024 that included howitzers, 155mm ammunition, anti-tank weaponry, rockets, grenades, helicopters, drones, communication devices, generators, and other equipment. Latvia's pledge to donate 1% of its GDP to Ukraine strengthens that commitment. Russia has failed to garner Baltic approval for its special military mission twice. Putin and the Kremlin aren't helped by Estonia. Estonia restricted Russian visa holders from visiting for sports, tourism, culture, or family and friends in September 2022. De-Russification in Estonia. Estonia, along with Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, has imposed strict restrictions on Russian citizens, blocking their entry to the Schengen area. This step, limiting Russian movement across Europe, has intensified since the Ukraine war. Estonia has also taken actions to de-Russify, including banning Russian media and limiting cultural exposure. Russian scholars in Estonia, like Andrei Makarovich, note rising hostility toward Russians, with many fearing association with Russia's actions in Ukraine. Despite this, some Russians in Estonia has committed substantial aid to Ukraine, planning to provide $1.29 billion in support by 2027. Additionally, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have recognized Russia's invasion as genocide. In retaliation, Russia issued a wanted list for Baltic leaders involved in removing Soviet-era monuments. Russia also banned 347 Baltic citizens from entering, a countermeasure to the Baltic states' strong opposition to Russia's actions. The Baltic states' historical experiences with Russia explain their rapid efforts to de-Russifice. As a result of the Ukraine war, the Baltic republics fear Russian assault. Their de-Russification shows a yearning for independence and a fear of Russia. You think, is their reaction justified or overreacting? Discuss in the comments. Thanks for watching, and check out our other videos.